righty. Well, we will get right back into the world of pests and pest management, one of the biggest issues in agriculture production. And I really feel like in terms of managing pests, it's all about a compromise between, how much money you can spend, and still make your crop profitable, and how much it costs to, control the pests. So we'll get right back into it. And we were talking about weeds and talking about how it's important first to classify them by life cycle. Same with pretty much any organism. Targeting it in the part of its life cycle, part of the stage of development of the plant or pest, disease, insect, whatever it is, when it is most susceptible is the most important consideration there. We also started to talk about invasive weed species and how they do potentially billions of dollars of damage to the economy. The big issue with invasive weed species is that they come into agroecosystems or ecosystems when they are disturbed. And so we have a large issue with that in agriculture, because we are constantly disturbing the soil to prepare it. So we'll get a little bit more here talking about weeds. And here's just an image depicting corn plots and just getting a visual there of what weeds can do. So the best thing you can do on the control of competitive plants is get them early. So on the left, they were removed early in the growing season. In the plot on the right, they're restricting the growth of the corn crop. And that's only going to become more restrictive as those weeds continue to grow. So they can be very damaging through the competition for nutrients, but in some cases also through chemical changes in the soil as a result of those weeds. For instance, when we used to grow carrots as a pretty good profit margin crop for us, we didn't have a whole lot of people at our local market selling carrots, and there was a lot of demand for it. So in growing them, we could pretty much control the price of them. However, if you have weeds in any root crops, especially in carrots, they can dramatically affect the growth of them. And one of our biggest problems was crabgrass, an annual weed that I'm sure we probably all dealt with at some point. It has this interesting allelopathic effect where it leaches these chemicals that will cause basically it to compete better. But in carrots, it causes them to dwarf the roots. You could have beautiful looking tops, but you have little teeny tiny carrots, and those don't always sell very well. So we're talking about annual weeds. We're really looking at some of the characteristics that make a plant a weed, and one of the big ones is their high volume of seed production. And we're talking about thousands, hundreds of thousands of seeds in some cases. So another thing on the annuals, if you have annual weeds, you definitely want to control them. Even if you couldn't get them early on, you need to control them before they go to seed. As you can see, we're producing a ton of seeds here in some of these very common and very damaging weeds, but they also have a great longevity in the soil seed bank. And this longevity here that they list in this chart is based on the half-life of the seeds. So that's how long it takes for germination percentage to be reduced by half. If you look at, say, crabgrass here, 150,000 seeds per plant per growing season, and a longevity in the seed bank of 50 years. Again, that's for half. So there's, of those 150,000 seeds, let's say the germination percent was 90%. After 50 years, that germination percentage is reduced to 50%. They also have longer dormancy periods. So if they're deeper in the soil seed bank, they can stay dormant. You bring them up to the top through cultivation, through tillage and plowing, and suddenly they're no longer dormant, and they have this great longevity. So high numbers, seed longevity, and seed dormancy are one of the big reasons for annuals being such bad weed problems in agricultural production. Also, the way that some weeds reproduce, some plants reproduce, can make them more of a nightmare, shall we say, more competitive. And these, we're looking at them being able to reproduce not only through producing seeds, but also through their vegetative reproductive structures. So we have Johnson grass over here on the left, really horrible perennial weed that also makes these really long rhizomes. The rhizome is just an underground kind of horizontally growing stem. When you're trying to control that, you want to try to get all the roots out. If any of those break off, they make a new crown, make a new plant. Similar here in the image with white clover, although personally I don't really consider white clover a weed because it's nitrogen fixing. So that kind of goes back to the whole concept that I mentioned on Monday, that weeds sometimes are plants whose virtues we have yet to understand. As a nitrogen fixer and a good kind of ground cover, a living mulch, if you will, I think that white clover is doing more good than harm. So you have to kind of weigh that as well. Here on C, we've got the yellow nut sedge, Cyperus esculentus. They make these little tubers, and they detach easily when you're pulling the weeds out of the soil. So that makes a new plant. So on and so forth. These vegetative structures make annual and perennial weeds more difficult to control. We also look at the genetics of plant species and how they can become more weedy. So one of the big characteristics here that we're looking at is the ability to change in morphology. The actual plant can change in different situations. So they call this phenotypic plasticity, which is basically the ability for an individual plant to adapt to different environments. So that's partially the genetics, but think about it in terms of like a dandelion, for instance. You have a dandelion growing, in a disturbed situation in your yard. It's maybe doesn't have as good of access to moisture and nutrients as if it were growing in your garden. So they can grow larger. The seed heads could produce more seeds. This is just part of that phenotypic plasticity, allowing them to adapt to different environments and become more difficult. As with any type of control, we first look at the cultural control. How can we change our production practices to influence our ability to take care of weeds? So one of the things that we can look at is just planting time. So many of the summer annual weeds emerge early. So if we prepare our soil, allow them to emerge, and then cultivate and then plant, then we've taken care of a good portion of them. We can also modify our crop row spacing as a way to shade out weeds. So they need light, they need the same things that all plants need. So if we can grow a crop that has a very dense canopy, that prevents the ability for weeds to compete very well. Crop rotation, also important. For instance, one of our crop rotations, we would plant what we would call cleaning crops. Like for instance, we would put squash down that has very large leaves that often will shade out weeds, acting kind of as a living mulch, preventing them from being able to grow. The next season we might grow potatoes, which when we're going through the potatoes, we're harvesting and removing weeds in the process, because we're actually digging those tubers up. So the next crop is likely to, the next growing season, to have less weeds in the seed bank to compete with. In some cases, if they're like in rice, for instance, we need a very wet environment. So if we flood that, then we can prevent some annual weeds by interrupting their ability to respire and get oxygen. Cover cropping is a great way to suppress germination and compete. If we keep the soil always covered, then we don't give weeds a chance to become established. Mention the whole alleopathy issue. It can kind of go both ways. So weeds can kind of influence our crops by spreading these chemicals that can affect our plants, or we can use cover crops that have an alleopathic effect to suppress the weeds. So it can kind of go both ways there. In terms of mechanical control, we look at all kinds of different tools, whether they're actual mechanical or more physical. So using hose by hand is one way that a lot of producers control weeds, trying to get as much of the root system out as possible when we're removing them. We also use the same things that we use for soil preparation, such as cultivators, discs, and harrows, to perform some weed control in crops. We can also use mowing or weed eating as well in some situations. And in this case, we're removing the weeds per se, but we're as they're bringing the nutrients to the top, we cut them, put them back down on the ground. We're kind of making a mulch, and we're also eliminating the production of seed. And if we're doing it at the right time, we're depleting their storage of particular nutrients and their ability to continue to grow. Mulching is another common method of weed suppression in all kinds of different crops. And on the mulching front, you really want to be careful of what type of mulch you're using. Some mulches can increase temperature in soil. That can be a good thing or a bad thing. Such as when we were talking about the colored plastic, the black plastic absorbs more heat, white plastic reflects it and keeps it cooler. A darker mulch, organic mulch, would do the same thing, whereas a lighter mulch like straw would reflect that light and keep it cooler. We can also use mulches just to smother weeds as well and turn them from a nuisance into a potential benefit as they break down and release organic matter into the soil. The other thing on mulching, you can also introduce pests and weeds through mulch, so you have to be careful with that. For instance, we would rather use straw, that's coming from one plant, coming often, we get like wheat straw, for instance. It's just the culms, those flowering stems, and often does not include very many seeds, although sometimes it does. Generally, though, they're harvesting straw before the crops go to seed. Versus hay, if we're using hay, then hay is a mix of all kinds of different plant species and timed differently. So some things might be blooming and going to seed, so you might actually be adding weed seeds in that case. Organic mulches are great because they're adding organic matter to the soil as they decompose. The plastic and fabric mulches tend to do a better job of smothering weeds out, preventing them from the first place. So a lot of organic growers commercially use plastic mulches in the rows, and then they might mow or weed eat in between the rows. You can also use fire as a weed control measure, and a couple of different things about fire. We can suppress, the weeds that are already there. we can also burn seeds that might be there as well. So controlled burning is a valuable tool in forest areas, but can also be used in between crops. We actually have flame weeders that we use sometimes in some vegetable production. Those are fun. Who doesn't like to use a flamethrower to control things? Got to be careful, of course. Biological weed control is successful in a few cases. And actually, I was listening to some news on the radio the other day about a Brazilian sweet pepper vine, which is it's not related to a pepper, but it's come and devastating parts of Florida. They're saying that a good portion of acreage in Florida is under control, and they're actually introducing thrips and insect pests that eat that as a way to prevent that weed from spreading. That can kind of be difficult, one, because it's not going to instantly control the weeds, and it's often not going to get complete control either. It's just reducing their ability to spread. It can be cost effective in some cases if the species that is controlling the weeds are able to actually establish themselves. One of the most common ways that we control weeds is through the use of herbicides, chemical controls. And there's all kinds of different herbicides that we can use to control weeds. I'm sure you've heard of many of those, and like glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup, has been in the news a lot lately because they believe it might be linked to Hodgkin's lymphoma or non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So in the use of herbicides, we have to be careful to be able to use them effectively. One, we want to look at the selectivity of herbicides. So we have broad spectrum herbicides or selective herbicides. And usually the biggest category there is whether it's controlling a monocot or a dicot, grassy type weeds or broadleaf type weeds. So in particular situations, you can make good use of those herbicides. You also want to time the application properly. When the crop is most susceptible, the smaller it is, the better. Also looking at its mode of action. So what does the herbicide actually do? Most of these herbicides actually starve the plant by interrupting their ability to synthesize amino acids and create proteins. So in doing so, they're trying to reuse the proteins in the plant, and eventually it starves itself and dies. That takes a while, whereas other types of herbicides will strip the plant of its cuticle and just dry it out completely. So looking at those modes of action are very important. So on the selectivity, whether it's grass or broadleaf killers or non-selective herbicides, we can also look at our, if we're planting like a Roundup Ready crop, for instance, we can spray the whole field in that case. It's likely to kill most of the weeds anyway. On the timing, we can look at the burn down herbicides that are applied to remove existing weeds, or we can look at pre-plant herbicides that we're applying before or after a crop is planted, depending on how we're planting the crop. These are incorporated into the soil. Pre-emergent herbicides are those that are applied after the crop planting, but before the emergence of the weeds. And they basically just prevent those plants from germinating, those seeds from germinating. So a lot of these pre-emergents, you apply them to the soil surface or work them into the soil. They do have to have some sort of rainfall or irrigation for them to be very effective. Post-emergence and burn down, a lot of these categories actually overlap. So the post-emergent herbicides are applied directly to the foliage. You have to get really good coverage of the weed for it to actually control it. All kinds of different equipment that we can use to control weeds as well, whether that's a backpack sprayer, a tractor mounted sprayer, a broadcast, spreading granules of, say, a pre-emergent, for instance. This is just a table looking at the different modes of action of herbicides on the plants themselves. So I mentioned the amino acid synthesis inhibitors. Fair amount of the popular herbicides do this. Some of these are disrupting the cell membrane of the plant. Some of these are growth regulators, which inhibit the production of auxin, or in some cases concentrate too much auxin, so the plant basically has too much growth in one particular area and stars itself. Some that just inhibit photosynthesis. So the mode of action is also important to look at. Moving from weeds to insects and mites, the arthropod pests. One of the big things here is diversity. So when we're growing crops as a monoculture, we're growing just one crop in a field, then there's so much of that crop available that the insects and mites basically have a buffet there, and they're going to go ham wild eating these plants unless you're using some insect control method. So we look at the creation of synthetic organic pesticides. Again, part of the green revolution post World War II. Some of these chemicals we were studying for chemical warfare then became used to kill insects and mites. One downside of the use of chemicals is that, especially if the chemicals are persistent in the environment, the pests can become resistant to the pesticides. And we have that in weeds as well with the herbicides. Just do a Google search on superweed. That's become a big issue with the Roundup Ready crops. So we're just constantly spraying. If one of those plants has the phenotypic plasticity to adapt to that, spraying of Roundup, they go to seed, then their, propagules are out there, and those are going to be developing higher resistance to it. So now they believe there's some weeds out there that are resistant to most herbicides, and become very difficult to control. So one of the things that we want to think about in insects, mites, other arthropods, is that most of the insects out there, growing or that are in our fields, in our ecosystems, are actually providing essential ecosystem services, and in some cases many useful benefits to agriculture. So we don't want to destroy the beneficials. We want to just target the pest species if we can. So we have some harmless species, some predator species that are going to eat other insects. We have our pollinator insects that we don't want to damage. And again, lots of stuff in the news lately about honeybees and the use of certain pesticides. Some countries have banned certain insecticides because of their destruction of honeybees. We also look at the genetic host resistance of our crop species. So we mentioned that earlier, but some cultivars of plants are resistant to attack by some insects. Again, a healthy plant is able to withstand some insect attack, in some cases even ward them off. We can also use biological controls, several different ways of doing that. We can kind of promote already existing beneficial species, or we can import some of these species. We can actually purchase biological controls. We can bring in things like ladybugs, praying mantises into certain situations, release them, and they eat the bad guys. So knowing what these beneficial insects look like, I think, is an important thing to examine. For instance, right here on the right, we've got this green lacewing. This is in the larval stage of that insect. where it's able to eat all kinds of small insect pests. And they're voracious feeders. They eat tons and tons of them. But I mean, at first look, it doesn't look like a good bug, right? You might want to try to destroy that if you see it, but it's actually doing a good thing. So kind of watching what the insects are doing and you know, kind of looking at each of them on an individual basis, recognizing the pests, but also recognizing the beneficial insects out there. Again, we're looking on the cultural side for insects. Planting at the right time, changing our planting date might make it possible to avoid particular weeds. For instance, I like to grow eggplant, and it's difficult here because we have a lot of flea beetles that are really, they love eggplant as a food. So what we've tried to do in order to control or prevent the damage of flea beetles is to grow really large transplants that are already growing strong and able to contend with the weed or the insect pest at the time of planting. And then we might introduce some other controls while it's growing to prevent them until it has the ability to outgrow any damage. And that's been very successful in our ability to grow eggplant. They have an example here looking at planting wheat after the fly-free date for the Hessian fly. So if that insect has a very particular life cycle, and if it doesn't have its host plant at the time that it needs to lay its eggs, then basically you can escape infestation. So looking at the timing of varieties, when are these crops maturing? How can you stagger that to where you don't get as much destruction from the pests itself? So some physical or mechanical control options for insects: leaving some fields fallow during critical life cycle periods so that the insects don't have a host to lay their eggs on is a good one. Also promoting areas where the beneficials do have a place to lay their eggs. In some cases we can look at screening soil to remove insect eggs. We could disc the soil between crops to bury or chip up prunings and crop residues, again, so they don't have that area to lay their eggs. We can hand pick insects. Sounds awful, but in some cases that can be successful. We can also use a strong blast of water, just hand watering, to knock some of these insects off of your crop, making them more susceptible to predators as well. We can pick up and destroy fallen fruit from crops. So again, so that there isn't something for the insects to feed on or lay their eggs in. And basically, almost all this is just looking at prevention of the habitat. If we prevent them from, occurring in the beginning, then hey, prevention is worth a pound of cure, right? Now it's a prevention. So all of our insect and similar pests are in the phylum Arthropoda, and they have different classes. And it's important to look at these different families and classes within that phylum, such as the arachnids that have mites, for instance, as a huge pest. Although most of the other things, the spiders are predators, right? So we don't necessarily want to destroy the spiders, but we need a particular type of pesticide, a miticide, to control mites. An insecticide is not going to control them. So distinguishing the difference between the different classes of pests in the arthropod phylum are very important. The insect class is usually what we think of as our main class of pest species, and we break that down into different orders. Some of our insecticides are specific to particular orders. It's the most diverse class of species on Earth. We have 80% of all species and animals are in the insect class. Crazy to think about. The other crazy part of that is that very few of those are actually pests. Only about 5% have some economic importance, and only about 1% of those actually reach the economic damage level that causes them to become a pest, classified as a pest. So looking at some of these insect orders, Coleoptera are the beetles that go through complete metamorphosis. Lepidoptera are butterflies, moths, and in their larval stage, they are caterpillars, and they're often foliage feeders. So looking at the life cycle again on insects, at what point is it actually damaging? In both of these cases, both of these go through a complete metamorphosis where they have a egg, larva, pupa, and adult stage. And these are usually only damaging in their larval stage. And in some cases, they're damaging in their larval stage, but they're beneficial in their adult stage. So targeting them at the right life stage is very important. The Hymenoptera includes pollinators and predators such as bees and wasps, as well as ants. So Diptera, flies, Heteroptera or Homoptera, the true bugs, and bug-like insects. The big thing in the different orders of the insects, it's just important to recognize that from this specificity of some insecticides to act on some of those orders to be effective on them, but also distinguishing between the beneficials and the negative, the pests. Most of those orders contain both. So this is just a simple thing, looking at the difference between insects and mites, and telling the difference because of that specificity of the pesticides. Big thing there, insects, of course, have 3 pairs of legs. They got 6 legs. Mites, spiders, etc., have 8 legs, right? 4 pairs. So we look at that. We look at their metamorphosis as ways to identify the insect pests. So we have some that have no metamorphosis, which basically the egg hatches and the nymph, the young version of it, basically looks like a miniature version of the adult. Then we have complete metamorphosis, where there's a very different stage of the larva looking different than the adult. And then the pupa stage is always going to be stationary as it's metamorphosing from the larva to the adult. We have same deal here in the gradual metamorphosis with a grasshopper here. The egg hatches. It looks very similar to the adult. And then in some cases, we have some life cycles not being present at all. So in this case, in dragonflies, we have some that go through complete and some that go through incomplete metamorphosis, where they're just missing the pupa stage here, but they do have kind of a larval stage that's different than the adult. Entomologists also look at, and pest managers look at, how the insects feed as a way, one, to control them, but also to identify them. So if we look at chewing insects, they're often feeding from the outside of a leaf inwards, or in some cases, chewing on the inside of a plant in the case of some of the stem borers, which can be difficult to see sometimes. So when we're scouting for them, we want to look at like what looks like sawdust as they're boring through, and for holes in the plants too. We also have sucking insects and mites that basically have like almost like a needle-like stylet. They're poking into the plant parts. They're sucking the juices out. These become damaging, and they make like a stippling effect on the upper side of the leaves, a way to scout for those. But they can be more damaging in the fact that they are vectors. They can be introducing a pathogen in their feeding. Here's some examples of vectors. In this case, we've got the silverleaf whitefly here. As it's feeding, as it's sucking the plant juices, it's introducing a pathogen here, a plant disease into a melon leaf here, and you can see this diseased leaf. So they're transmitting it and moving it, and often these insects are very damaging, and we want to be, basically have zero tolerance for them. You see them, you want to control them. So talking about the ways of controlling them, looking at how pesticides can, the mode of entry into the body of the insect. So we have systemic insecticides, which are those that are going to enter the insect through its feeding and then kill it through its absorption into its digestive tract. So in this case, we're applying it to the plant surface. The pesticide residue has to remain there long enough for the insect to actually feed on it so it can kill it. So in this case, we have to really look at the timing of our application of the pesticide. Rain, of course, is going to wash it off. Irrigation, overhead irrigation, do the same thing. Some systemics we look at as putting into the plant tissues. So the plant will actually absorb it, translocate it. So the insect, especially the sucking insects, are able to be controlled through this type. However, we have to watch out on the timing of that, because if it's in the plant tissues, it could potentially be harmful for people too. So looking at the timing of harvest to make sure that it degrades. Contact poisons, we have to actually hit the body of the insect for it to be effective. And usually these are removing the cuticle that's on the insect itself. We can also look at inhalants or fumigants, or vapors or dust that the insect absorbs through its respiratory system to destroy it. We look at the cell membrane disruptors, kind of a similar thing as in the weeds. There are some that are chemical synthetic, and some that are kind of more natural organic versions, such as the oils and soaps, that basically smother them and disrupt the cell membranes, causing them to just basically dry out. You can also look at hormone disruption, and basically these are disrupting the ability of the insect to advance its life cycle, or sterilizing it so it can the adults cannot lay eggs. This will prevent future generations. So if you can control all of the pests that are there currently after you've applied this, then you can eliminate pest problems. So these are usually insect growth regulators, IGRs, that we use in this case. Some of them will keep them in a juvenile state. Some of them will prevent them from being able to molt. Some of them will prevent them from being able to lay eggs. And many of these have specific targets, which allows them to be able to be used in conjunction with some biological controls too. We can also use pheromones. A couple of different ways to use those. One, to disrupt the ability for the insects to communicate with each other and to mate, or also to as a trap, as a bait, to get them to come in and then apply a pesticide in just one place. We have desiccants that cause them basically just to dry out. Diatomaceous earth is a OMRI listed natural dust that is basically just a bunch of dried out diatoms that basically just, they're razor sharp. They cut the insect's cuticle, reduce its ability to withstand dry periods. They dry out and die. Desiccants, of course, work best in dry environments. There's all kinds of different chemicals out there for controlling insect pests, and we look at these as being classified by their chemistry. And these are approved and registered for use by the EPA. And really, some of these, historically have become very damaging. So we have stopped using them. So, for instance, the inorganic compounds, often looking at those that, by inorganic, we're talking about they are not carbon based. So things like arsenic, sulfur compounds, a lot of these we don't use them as much because they are more toxic and not very effective. So a lot of their registrations have been canceled by the EPA. The biorational compounds, we're looking at those that are the plant derivatives, such as pyrethrum, rotenone, and nicotine, as well as a directant, an extract from the neem tree that, basically we witness that insect pests don't feed on these plants, or by feeding on them, they die. So we developed preparations based on these plant derivatives and use these. Most of those are able to be used in organic production. For the synthetic organic chemicals, we're looking at, again, not like certified organic, but they're called organic because they are carbon based. So we have chlorinated hydrocarbons such as DDT that, although it was discovered in Germany in 1874, it wasn't used until the 30s as a pesticide, when it was discovered that it actually had pesticidal action. I'm sure everybody is familiar with DDT and the story behind it. Basically, it was eventually banned because of its persistent in the ecosystem, which allowed it to bioaccumulate and bioconcentrate up the food chain. So it's found that it was causing death in eagles, for instance, the bald eagle. And since the banning of DDT, the bald eagle has made a big comeback. Organic phosphates have good insecticidal properties. Those are some that are still out there today. Carbamates, just a different style. Most of these are systemic and highly toxic, both to insects and to people. There's some are still on the market. Some have been banned. The pyrethroids, basically we're looking at pyrethrum that came from the pyrethrum daisy, and then, so it was a biorational compound, but then we synthesized it. So it's, more effective in that synthetic form, and it kills a broad spectrum of insect pests. The neonicotinoids have received a lot of attention lately in the news. They're basically like a nerve toxin, interrupts the nervous system of the insect, but they also affect the pollinators. So some countries have actually banned neonicotinoids because of their destruction of bees, although they generally say that they're are very safe for people. So we have to weigh the downsides and the benefits of all chemicals. And I think one of the biggest downsides of the use of chemicals is really the economics of it. It costs a lot of money to apply some of these pesticides. We can look at oils as well, and a lot of growers, especially in like indoor plant industries, are using essential oils and using like the doTERRA release of some of these oils as a way to repel particular insects. So it's not actually controlling them in some cases, it's just making, a less favorable environment for them. We also have microbial insecticides. It's kind of considered a biological control based on toxins produced by bacteria, fungi, and viruses. One of the most common versions of these is BT, Bacillus thuringiensis, which is a fungus that, when consumed, kills insects from the inside out. So some companies have actually genetically engineered crops to actually produce BT in the leaves. Of course, insect pests are, often get the spotlight because there's so many of them, and we think of them as doing a lot of damage and being difficult to control because of large populations. But we can also have a lot of damage from other animals, vertebrates. So rats in particular, mostly, affecting our, stored food crops. So what has been harvested. So They also do feed on unharvested fruits and vegetables in some cases as well. But generally, if we're producing grain, we want to prevent rats from being able to get in there, or mice too, because with their droppings, for instance, they can cause hantavirus, all kinds of issues associated with them. They can be vectors for the plague as well. So looking at preventing their habitat from removing food and water, bait traps for them, and also using some rodenticides as well. All kinds of other vertebrate pests too. I mean, deer, extremely damaging and extremely difficult to get rid of. With the larger vertebrates, of course, you can hunt them. If you can get damage stamps, if you can prove that they are doing damage to your crops, then you can actually go to DGIF and get a damage stamp, allow you to hunt them out of season. So that can be a potential way to get some control, but also maybe put some meat in the freezer. Gophers, groundhogs, rabbits, all kinds of different mammal pests, and they are difficult to control. Sometimes we look at trapping as a potential way in Commonwealth. If you trap any kind of mammal pest, you have to kill it. You cannot legally move them without a license. Birds can also be a major menace to fruiting crops, grain crops. Some birds will, like crows, for instance, will come into fields and just pull up seedlings. Different situations, different pests. So it's important to examine your agroecosystem, your cropping, your cultural, your production methods. How can you prevent the pests in the first place? With crows, we might put out a scarecrow. We might use some repellents, might use noise, we might use bird netting. Often the prevention of the damage costs less in some cases than trying to control them. So we use things like scare tactics, explosives even in some cases, amplified recordings of bird distress calls. Dogs, anyone? You got a dog, you have a farm dog out there near your crop. We used to do that with our sweet corn. We like to grow sweet corn to eat it and also to sell it, but the raccoons and deer also love it. So when it comes time to harvest, and it's funny because the deer and raccoons, they tend to wait until it's at its prime before they go for it. We'd camp out right before it's ready for harvest time, and just to prevent them from being there, have the dog outside of the tent. Sounds ridiculous, but some things we have to go to, some significant measures to prevent pest damage. We'll start talking about disease here next week, since we run out of time once again, and it's a whole nother bag there with plant diseases. But figured ask if anybody has any questions or concerns before we sign off. All righty, well, thank you all. You all have a great day.